The autumn morning air was crisp as 17-year-old Marcus Wellington stepped out of his father's gleaming black Tesla Model S in front of Lincoln High School. Everything about Marcus screamed privilege. His designer clothes, his perfectly styled hair, the latest iPhone in his manicured hands, and most notably, the air of superiority that seemed to follow him like an expensive cologne. Marcus was the son of Richard Wellington, one of the most successful tech entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley. The Wellington family lived in a mansion worth $12 million, owned vacation homes in 3 different countries, and Marcus had never known a day of financial struggle in his life. This privilege had shaped him into someone who believed the world owed him everything, and that his family's wealth made him inherently better than others. "Don't forget, Marcus," his father had said that morning over breakfast in their marble-countered kitchen. "The college admissions officer from Harvard is visiting your school today. Make sure you make the right impression. Your future depends on it." Marcus had simply nodded, confident that his family's connections and donations to the university would secure his admission regardless of his actual merit. After all, that's how things had always worked in his world. Money opened doors, and the Wellington name carried weight that could move mountains. As Marcus walked through the hallways of Lincoln High, other students automatically moved aside. Some did so out of fear, others out of a learned deference to his family's influence in the community. Marcus had cultivated this atmosphere deliberately, using his wealth and his father's connections to ensure that he was treated as the unofficial king of the school. "Marcus," called out his girlfriend Stephanie as she hurried to catch up with him. Stephanie came from a similarly wealthy family and was equally accustomed to getting her way through financial influence rather than personal merit. "Did you hear about the new community service requirement?" she asked, slightly out of breath from trying to match his confident stride. "Apparently, we need to complete 50 hours of community service to graduate. Can you believe they're making us waste our time with that nonsense?" Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression showing the kind of irritation that came from someone who had never been told no in his life. "Community service? What kind of ridiculous requirement is that? Don't they know who we are? My father donates more money to this school district than most families make in a year." "I know, right?" Stephanie agreed, adjusting her designer handbag. "My dad is already calling the school board. This is exactly the kind of thing that shouldn't apply to families like ours." As they continued walking, Marcus noticed a commotion near the main entrance of the school. A small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be an elderly man who was struggling with some boxes and papers that had scattered across the ground. The man looked to be in his 70s, with grey hair, weathered hands, and clothes that had clearly seen better days. "Looks like some homeless guy wandered onto campus," Marcus said with a smirk, loud enough for several nearby students to hear. "Security should really do a better job of keeping the riffraff out." The elderly man was actually Harold Morrison, a 73-year-old Korean War veteran who had volunteered to help with the school's new mentorship program for at-risk students. Hank had served his country with distinction, earning multiple medals for bravery, and had spent the decades since his military service working as a high school teacher and community volunteer. He had recently retired from teaching and was dedicating his time to helping young people who reminded him of his younger self, kids who needed guidance and support to reach their potential. That morning, Hank had been carrying boxes of books and materials for the mentorship program when he had tripped slightly on the school's front steps. The contents of the boxes had scattered, and he was now trying to gather everything while dealing with a knee that had been injured during his military service and still gave him trouble on cold mornings. Several students had stopped to help, but Marcus was not among them. Instead, he saw an opportunity to demonstrate his perceived superiority to his peers. "Hey, old man," Marcus called out as he approached, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that came from someone who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "This is a school, not a homeless shelter. Maybe you should find somewhere else to dig through trash." The students who had been helping Hank stopped what they were doing and looked up in shock. Even by Marcus's standards, this was particularly cruel. Hank slowly straightened up, his weathered hands still holding some of the scattered papers, and looked directly at Marcus. "I'm sorry if I'm in your way, son," Hank said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of dignity that comes from a lifetime of service and sacrifice. "I'm just here to help with the school's mentorship program." Marcus laughed, a sound that held no warmth or humor. "Mentorship program? What could someone like you possibly teach anyone? Look at yourself. You can't even dress properly or carry a box without making a mess." The crowd of students had grown larger, and Marcus was clearly enjoying the attention. He had learned early in life that putting others down was an easy way to make himself feel superior, and he had never encountered anyone who had effectively challenged this behavior. "I mean, seriously," Marcus continued, his voice getting louder and more mocking. "What kind of mentor shows up looking like he just crawled out of a dumpster? If this is the best the school can do for role models, no wonder the education system is falling apart." Stephanie giggled at her boyfriend's comments, and a few other students from wealthy families joined in with nervous laughter. But most of the students looked uncomfortable, recognizing that Marcus had crossed a line from his usual arrogance into something much more cruel. Hank continued to gather his materials, his movements slow and deliberate. When he spoke again, his voice remained calm and measured, but there was something in his eyes that suggested depths of experience and strength that Marcus couldn't begin to comprehend. "You know, son," Hank said, "I've met a lot of young people in my time. Some of them started out thinking that their circumstances made them better than others. But life has a way of teaching us all that real worth comes from what we do for others, not what we have for ourselves." Marcus felt a flash of anger at what he perceived as a lecture from someone he considered beneath him. "Don't call me son," he snapped, "and don't try to give me life advice. My family has more money than you've probably seen in your entire pathetic life. I don't need lessons from some old loser who can't even afford decent clothes." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several students gasped audibly, and even Stephanie looked uncomfortable with how far Marcus had gone. But Marcus was too caught up in his own sense of superiority to notice the changing mood of his audience. "In fact," Marcus continued, pulling out his phone, "this is going to make a great story for my social media. Local school hires homeless man as mentor. Oh, my followers are going to love this." As Marcus raised his phone to take a picture of Hank, intending to mock him online, something unexpected happened. The school's principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, appeared at the entrance, having heard the commotion from her office. "Mr. Wellington," she said sharply, "what exactly is going on here?" Marcus turned toward the principal with his usual confident smirk, expecting that his family's influence would protect him from any real consequences. "Just documenting the school's questionable hiring practices, Mrs. Rodriguez. I think my father and the school board would be very interested to know that you're bringing homeless people onto campus to mentor students." Mrs. Rodriguez looked from Marcus to Hank, and her expression grew increasingly stern. "Mr. Wellington, I'd like you to meet Harold Morrison. Mr. Morrison is a decorated Korean War veteran, a retired teacher with 40 years of experience and one of the most respected community volunteers in our city. He has graciously agreed to donate his time to help our students, and he deserves nothing but respect and gratitude." Marcus felt the first flicker of uncertainty, but his pride prevented him from backing down. "Well, maybe he should dress the part if he wants respect," he muttered, though with noticeably less confidence than before. It was at that moment that Hank Morrison made a decision that would change not only Marcus's life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed what happened next. The old veteran had spent decades working with young people, and he recognized something in Marcus that others might have missed. Beneath the arrogance and cruelty was a young man who had never been taught the values that truly mattered in life. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Hank said quietly, "if it's all right with you, I'd like to make Mr. Wellington here a special project of mine." The silence that followed Hank Morrison's words was so complete that Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. Around him, the crowd of students waited to see what would happen next, while Mrs. Rodriguez studied both the elderly veteran and the arrogant teenager with the calculating expression of someone who had spent decades managing adolescent drama. "What exactly do you mean by special project, Mr. Morrison?" Mrs. Rodriguez asked, though there was something in her tone that suggested she was intrigued rather than concerned. Hank Morrison straightened to his full height, and for the first time, Marcus noticed that despite his age and casual clothes, there was something unmistakably commanding about the old man's presence. It was the kind of bearing that came from years of leadership and responsibility, though Marcus was too inexperienced to recognize it. "Well," Hank said, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face, "it seems to me that young Mr. Wellington here has some very strong opinions about worth and value. I think it might be educational for him to spend some time learning about different perspectives on those subjects." Marcus felt a chill of unease, though he couldn't quite articulate why. "I don't need to learn anything from you," he said, but his voice lacked the confident arrogance it had carried just minutes before. "Oh, I think you do," Hank replied calmly. "In fact, I'm going to make you a proposition, son. You seem to think that money and privilege are the only measures of a person's worth, so let's test that theory." Mrs. Rodriguez crossed her arms, clearly interested in where this was heading. Several teachers had emerged from the building, drawn by the commotion, and Marcus was beginning to realize that he had attracted far more attention than he had intended. "Here's what I propose," Hank continued. "You and I are going to spend the next month working together on a project. At the end of that month, we'll see who has learned more about what really matters in life." "That's ridiculous," Marcus scoffed, though he was beginning to feel like he was losing control of the situation. "I'm not wasting my time on some pointless project with you." "Afraid you might learn something?" Hank asked with a slight smile that somehow managed to be both kind and challenging at the same time. The question hit Marcus like a slap. No one had ever suggested that he was afraid of anything, and certainly not afraid of learning from someone he considered inferior. His pride flared, overriding his common sense. "I'm not afraid of anything," Marcus declared loudly, "especially not of some old man who thinks he can teach me about life." "Excellent," Hank said. "Then you'll accept my challenge." "What challenge?" Marcus demanded, though part of him already regretted asking. Hank Morrison had spent 40 years teaching high school students, and he had learned how to read teenagers better than they could read themselves. He could see that Marcus's arrogance was built on a foundation of insecurity and inexperience, and he knew exactly how to use the boy's pride against him. "The challenge is simple," Hank explained. "For the next month, you're going to work with me on a community service project. But here's the catch. You can't use your family's money, connections, or influence. You'll have to rely entirely on your own merit, your own skills, and your own character." Several students in the crowd exchanged glances. They all knew Marcus well enough to know that he had never done anything without the backing of his family's wealth and influence. "And what exactly would this project involve?" Marcus asked suspiciously. "We're going to renovate the community center in the Riverside neighborhood," Hank said. "It's been closed for 2 years due to lack of funding, but the community desperately needs it. We're going to reopen it, and we're going to do it without spending a dime of your daddy's money." Marcus felt his stomach drop. The Riverside neighborhood was the poorest area of the city, a place he had driven through exactly once in his life and had no desire to visit again. The idea of doing manual labor in such a place was almost incomprehensible to him. "That's impossible," Marcus said. "You can't renovate a building without money." "Can't you?" Hank asked with that same infuriating smile. "I guess we'll find out. Unless, of course, you're admitting that you're not capable of accomplishing anything without your family's money." The challenge was perfectly crafted to trap Marcus's pride. If he refused, he would be admitting that he was indeed incapable of succeeding on his own merit. If he accepted, he would be committing to a month of work that was completely outside his comfort zone. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, decided to intervene. "Mr. Wellington," she said, "this sounds like an excellent way for you to complete your community service requirement. In fact, I think this project could count for all 50 hours you need for graduation." Marcus felt the trap closing around him. The community service requirement was real, and he had been planning to have his father arrange for him to fulfill it through some nominal volunteer work at a charity that his family supported. This alternative was far more challenging and uncomfortable than anything he had envisioned. "And, Mrs. Rodriguez continued, I think this would be an excellent opportunity for you to demonstrate the kind of leadership and character that colleges like Harvard are looking for in their applicants." The mention of Harvard hit Marcus like a physical blow. Despite his family's wealth and connections, he knew that his academic record was mediocre at best, and he needed something impressive on his application to distinguish himself from other wealthy applicants. "Fine," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "I accept your ridiculous challenge, but when I prove that this whole thing is impossible, I want everyone here to remember that I was right." "Oh, I'm sure we'll all remember this conversation," Hank said with genuine warmth in his voice for the first time. "But Marcus, I want you to understand something. This isn't about proving who's right or wrong. This is about giving you an opportunity to discover capabilities you didn't know you had." "Whatever," Marcus muttered, already regretting his decision, but unable to back down without losing face in front of half the school. "Excellent," Hank said, clapping his hands together. "We start tomorrow after school. Meet me at the Riverside Community Center at 3:30 p.m. And Marcus—" "What?" Marcus asked sullenly. "Wear clothes you don't mind getting dirty." As the crowd began to disperse and Marcus walked away with Stephanie, he could hear the whispered conversations of his classmates. Some were expressing disbelief that he had accepted such a challenge. Others were speculating about whether he would actually follow through, and a few were already placing bets on how long he would last. "Marcus, what were you thinking?" Stephanie demanded as soon as they were out of earshot of the others. "You can't seriously be planning to spend a month doing manual labor with some old man in the ghetto." "Of course not," Marcus replied, though he sounded less certain than usual. "I'll figure out a way to get out of it. Maybe my dad can have the old man removed from the program, or maybe I can find some loophole in the agreement." But even as he said the words, Marcus knew that backing out now would be social suicide. Too many people had witnessed the challenge, and word would spread throughout the school within hours. If he failed to follow through, he would become a laughingstock, and his carefully cultivated image of superiority would be destroyed. That evening, as Marcus sat in his bedroom in the family mansion, staring out at the perfectly manicured grounds, he tried to convince himself that he could complete this challenge easily. After all, how hard could it be? He was intelligent, he was determined, and he had always gotten what he wanted in life. What Marcus didn't realize was that Harold Morrison had just given him the greatest gift of his young life, the opportunity to discover who he really was beneath all the privilege and arrogance. The next month would test everything Marcus thought he knew about himself, about success, and about what it truly meant to be a man of worth. The challenge had been accepted, and there was no turning back. The next afternoon, Marcus Wellington stood outside the Riverside Community Center, staring at a building that looked like it had been abandoned for decades rather than just 2 years. The windows were boarded up, graffiti covered most of the exterior walls, and weeds had grown through cracks in the sidewalk. This was so far removed from Marcus's usual environment that he felt like he had stepped into a different world entirely. He had arrived in his father's Tesla, which now looked absurdly out of place, parked on the cracked asphalt of the community center's parking lot. Marcus had spent considerable time that morning choosing his outfit, finally settling on clothes that were expensive but that he considered disposable. A designer t-shirt that had cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week, and jeans that were artfully distressed by high-end designers rather than by actual work. Hank Morrison was already there, wearing work boots, faded jeans, and a flannel shirt that had clearly seen years of actual labor. He was examining the building's exterior with the practiced eye of someone who understood construction and renovation. "You're late," Hank said without turning around when he heard Marcus approach. "I'm exactly on time," Marcus replied defensively, checking his expensive watch. "It's 3:30. Son, when you're working on a project like this, on time means you're late. You should be here early, ready to work, with a plan for what you want to accomplish." Hank finally turned to face Marcus, and his expression was neutral but assessing. "But I suppose that's the first lesson you'll need to learn." Marcus felt a flash of his usual irritation at being corrected, but something about Hank's calm authority made him hold his tongue. Instead, he looked around at the neighborhood surrounding the community center. It was unlike anywhere he had ever spent time. Small houses with peeling paint, cars that had seen better days, and an overall atmosphere of economic struggle that was completely foreign to his experience. "So what exactly are we supposed to do here?" Marcus asked, gesturing at the obviously deteriorated building. "This place looks like it should be torn down, not renovated." "That's where you're wrong," Hank said, walking toward the building's main entrance. "This building has good bones. It was built in 1952, and they knew how to construct things to last back then. What it needs isn't demolition. It needs care, attention, and people who are willing to see its potential rather than just its problems." Hank produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the front door. "The city gave me permission to work on this project," he explained. "They're happy to have someone willing to take it on, especially since the alternative is letting it continue to deteriorate." As they stepped inside, Marcus was struck by how different the interior was from what he had expected. Yes, there was dust and evidence of neglect, but the basic structure was solid. High ceilings, large windows that would let in plenty of light once they were uncovered, and an open floor plan that could accommodate a variety of community activities. "This used to be the heart of the Riverside neighborhood," Hank explained as they walked through the main room. "Kids came here after school for tutoring and activities. Seniors had their weekly social gatherings. Families held birthday parties and community meetings. When it closed, the neighborhood lost something important." "Why did it close?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious despite himself. "Funding," Hank said simply. "The city had budget cuts, and community centers in low-income neighborhoods are always the first things to go. The people who live here don't have the political influence to fight for what they need." Marcus nodded, though he didn't really understand the implications of what Hank was saying. In his world, when something was needed, money was simply allocated to make it happen. The idea that good programs could disappear due to lack of funding was intellectually comprehensible, but emotionally foreign to him. "So, what's our plan?" Marcus asked, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Our plan," Hank said, "is to renovate this place using nothing but donated materials, volunteer labor, and our own ingenuity. No money changes hands, no favors are called in, no shortcuts are taken. We're going to prove that a community can come together to create something valuable." "That's impossible," Marcus said immediately. "You can't renovate a building without spending money. You need materials, tools, professional contractors." "Do you?" Hank asked. "Let me ask you something, Marcus. What do you think people did before they were professional contractors? How do you think communities built things before there were big construction companies?" Marcus had never considered these questions. In his experience, when something needed to be built or fixed, you hired professionals and paid them to handle it. The idea of doing the work yourself or relying on community cooperation was completely outside his frame of reference. "I don't know," Marcus admitted reluctantly. "They worked together," Hank said. "They shared skills, they shared resources, and they shared the labor. One person might be good with electrical work, another might know plumbing, someone else might be skilled at painting or carpentry. When everyone contributes what they can, amazing things become possible." Over the next hour, Hank walked Marcus through the building, explaining what needed to be done and how they might accomplish it. The scope of the project was overwhelming. The electrical system needed updating, the plumbing required repairs, the walls needed painting, the floors needed refinishing, and dozens of other tasks needed to be completed. "This is going to take forever," Marcus said, feeling discouraged for the first time in his life by a challenge that couldn't be solved with money. "Rome wasn't built in a day," Hank replied. "But it was built one stone at a time by people who were committed to the vision of what it could become." As they prepared to leave that first day, Hank handed Marcus a notebook. "I want you to do some homework," he said. "Go home tonight and research this neighborhood. Find out about its history, its demographics, its challenges. Learn about the people who live here and what this community center means to them." "Why?" Marcus asked. "Because," Hank said, "you can't effectively help people if you don't understand them, and you can't understand them if you don't take the time to learn about their lives and their experiences." That evening, Marcus sat in his bedroom with his laptop, reluctantly beginning the research assignment. What he discovered surprised him. The Riverside neighborhood had once been a thriving middle-class community, home to factory workers, teachers, and small business owners. But economic changes over the decades had led to job losses, population decline, and reduced city services. The more Marcus read, the more he began to understand that the people living in Riverside weren't there because they were lazy or unmotivated, as he had unconsciously assumed. They were there because of economic forces beyond their control, and many of them were working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. He found articles about the community center's closure and was surprised to read about the passionate community meetings where residents had fought to keep it open. Elderly people had spoken about losing their only social outlet. Parents had talked about having nowhere safe for their children to go after school. Community leaders had presented detailed plans for keeping the center operational, but the city's budget constraints had made it impossible. For the first time in his life, Marcus began to understand that there were problems in the world that couldn't be solved simply by having enough money. More importantly, he began to realize that there were people who faced challenges and obstacles that he had never even considered. The next day at school, Marcus found himself looking at his classmates differently. When Stephanie complained about her parents refusing to buy her a second car, Marcus found himself thinking about families in Riverside who didn't own any car at all. When his friends discussed their spring break plans to Europe, Marcus thought about kids in Riverside who had never been outside their own neighborhood. "You're being weird," Stephanie told him at lunch. "Ever since yesterday, you've been acting strange. Please tell me you're not actually taking this community service thing seriously." Marcus looked at his girlfriend with her designer clothes and casual assumption that the world existed to serve her needs, and for the first time he felt a distance between them that had nothing to do with physical space. "I'm just thinking," he said. "About what?" "About things I've never thought about before." And that, Marcus was beginning to realize, was exactly the point. 3 weeks into the project, Marcus Wellington was unrecognizable from the arrogant teenager who had mocked an elderly veteran in front of his school. His designer clothes had been replaced by work boots, jeans with genuine wear marks, and t-shirts that bore the honest stains of actual labor. His soft hands were now calloused from handling tools and materials, and his perfectly styled hair was usually covered by a baseball cap to keep dust and debris out of his eyes. More importantly, the change in Marcus went far deeper than his appearance. The community center project had introduced him to a world he never knew existed, a world where people solved problems through cooperation rather than competition, where worth was measured by contribution rather than consumption, and where the most respected individuals were those who gave the most of themselves to help others. Hank Morrison had been a masterful teacher, though his methods were unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his privileged educational journey. Instead of lecturing, Hank taught through example. Instead of giving answers, he asked questions that forced Marcus to think differently about everything he had previously taken for granted. "Marcus," Hank said on this particular afternoon as they worked together to install new light fixtures in what would become the center's main activity room. "Tell me what you've learned about leadership." Marcus paused in his work, considering the question carefully. 3 weeks ago, he would have answered immediately with something about commanding others and getting his way. Now, after working alongside community volunteers who had taught him more about real leadership than he had ever imagined possible, his understanding had fundamentally changed. "I used to think leadership meant telling people what to do," Marcus said slowly. "But I've learned that real leadership means figuring out what needs to be done and then inspiring people to want to do it." Hank nodded approvingly. "Give me an example." Marcus thought about the previous week when they had needed to remove old carpeting from the center's floors. It was back-breaking work that nobody wanted to do, but Marcus had noticed that when he started working harder than anyone else, without complaining, others had naturally followed his example. "When we were pulling up that old carpet," Marcus said, "I realized that nobody was going to work harder than the person they saw as the leader. So if I wanted people to give their best effort, I had to give mine first." "And how did that feel?" Hank asked. "Different," Marcus admitted. "At first I hated it. I kept thinking that this was the kind of work other people should be doing for me. But then I started to feel proud, I guess. Proud that I could do it, proud that I was contributing something real." The transformation in Marcus had not gone unnoticed by the community volunteers who had joined the project. At first, they had been skeptical of the wealthy teenager who had arrived in an expensive car and clearly had no experience with manual labor. But Marcus's willingness to learn, his growing respect for their knowledge and experience, and his genuine commitment to the project had gradually won them over. "You know," said Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman from the neighborhood who had been volunteering her time to help with painting, "when Hank first told us about you, we thought you were just another rich kid doing community service to look good on college applications." Marcus looked up from the wall he was painting, his face showing a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. "What changed your mind?" "Last week, when you spent your own money to buy lunch for all the volunteers," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "And not just any lunch. You remembered that Mr. Garcia is diabetic, that Sarah is vegetarian, and that little Tommy doesn't like onions. That's when we knew you were really paying attention to us as people." The incident Mrs. Rodriguez was referring to had been a turning point for Marcus. He had initially offered to buy lunch simply because he was hungry and assumed everyone else was too. But when he had started taking orders, he had found himself really listening to people's preferences and dietary restrictions. For the first time in his life, he had focused on meeting other people's needs rather than just his own. "It wasn't a big deal," Marcus said, though he was clearly pleased by the recognition. "Yes, it was," said Mr. Garcia, who was working on electrical repairs nearby. "You could have just ordered pizza for everyone and called it good. Instead, you treated each of us like individuals who mattered. That's not something you can fake." As the afternoon progressed, Marcus found himself reflecting on how much his perspective had changed. The community center project had introduced him to people whose life experiences were completely different from his own, but who possessed wisdom, skills, and character that he deeply admired. There was Mrs. Chen, a retired seamstress who had taught Marcus how to repair torn fabric and who spoke eloquently about the importance of preserving and maintaining things rather than simply replacing them. There was Carlos, a young father who worked 2 jobs but still found time to volunteer because he wanted his children to have the same opportunities he had missed. There was Sarah, a college student who was studying social work and who had helped Marcus understand the complex social and economic factors that affected communities like Riverside. "Hank," Marcus said, as they cleaned up their tools at the end of the day, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Why did you take on this project? I mean, you're retired. You could be relaxing, traveling, doing whatever you want. Why spend your time trying to help a community that most people have forgotten about?" Hank was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see that the question had touched something deep in the older man's experience. "When I was in Korea," Hank said finally, "I learned something about what really matters in life. I saw young men who had everything to live for give their lives to protect people they had never met. I saw communities that had been destroyed by war come together to rebuild, not because they had to, but because they understood that their survival depended on taking care of each other." Hank paused, looking around the community center that was slowly being transformed through their collective efforts. "When I came home from the war," he continued, "I made a promise to myself that I would spend my life trying to build the kind of community that those young men died protecting. A community where people look out for each other, where everyone has value, and where we measure success by how well we take care of the most vulnerable among us." Marcus felt something shift inside him as he listened to Hank's words. For the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand what it meant to have a purpose that went beyond personal gain. "What about you, Marcus?" Hank asked. "What do you want your life to stand for?" The question caught Marcus off guard. Throughout his 17 years, he had never seriously considered what he wanted his life to represent. His goals had always been focused on accumulating more wealth, status, and power than his peers. But now, after 3 weeks of working alongside people who measured success very differently, those goals seemed hollow and meaningless. "I don't know," Marcus said honestly. "I used to think I wanted to be rich and powerful, but now I think I want to be useful. I want to be the kind of person who makes things better rather than just taking advantage of what other people have built." Hank smiled, and Marcus could see genuine pride in the older man's eyes. "That's a good start," he said. "And you know what? I think you're well on your way." As Marcus drove home that evening, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 3 weeks. The community center was nearly ready to reopen, but more importantly, Marcus had discovered capabilities and values within himself that he never knew existed. When he arrived at his family's mansion, his father was waiting for him in the driveway. "Marcus," Richard Wellington said, "we need to talk. I've been hearing some very strange reports about how you've been spending your time, and I think it's time we discussed your priorities." Marcus looked at his father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in his life. Richard Wellington was a successful man by conventional measures, but Marcus now understood that success could be defined in many different ways. "You're right, Dad," Marcus said. "We do need to talk, but I think you might be surprised by what I have to say." The conversation that followed would determine not just Marcus's immediate future, but the kind of man he would choose to become. The end disclaimer. This story is entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, situations, and circumstances are products of imagination and do not represent real people, living or deceased, or actual events. Any resemblance to reality is purely coincidental.